All right, welcome back, everyone. Here we are, last panel of the day. So exciting. I hope everyone's energy is still good because mine's is. Because anytime I get a chance to listen to Zach or Andrea speak, I just get to sit and bask in the awesomeness that is our Faunalytics research department. We are talking today about how advocates can understand and assess research. We're in an age of information overload. How can animal advocates discern what research to trust and how to apply insights effectively? Again, we have our research scientists, Zach Waldork and Andrea Polanco here, and I'll let them introduce themselves before we hop into a chat, which will be then followed by a Q&A. So if you have questions for Zach and Andrea, please do make sure to drop them in the Q&A box. Zach, let's start with you. Who are you?
I'm Zach. My background is in political science and economics. I've worked on some studies for Faunalytics looking at how people make purchasing decisions, the ins and outs, I guess, of the animal ag industry in the US and around the world, and most recently about how voters feel about pro animal candidates. A lot of my work has been focused on how we can better understand the industries that are causing animal suffering and how we can sort of affect change at both the individual and institutional levels.
Hey
And Andrea,
everyone,
how about you?
got ahead of you, Carl. Yeah, so I recognize some of the names in the audience. Thank you so much for being here at the end of the day. But yeah, my background and my PhD is in animal welfare science, but I now conduct social science here at Faunalytics. Really happy to have made that transition. And at Faunalytics, I've led studies that investigate the impact of different forms of animal advocacy on people's animal product consumption, as an example. But more recently, I've run studies that investigate the strength of our movement in terms of pay gaps and equity issues. So, as a movement, we don't just need data behind our tactics, but it's also really important to understand how our organizations run so that we can avoid things like burnout and so we can avoid, so that we can attract people to join our movement as well.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. So we're going to dive right into this. We have a few topic areas we're hoping to cover, but again, if you have questions about anything that we talk about or anything else related to research that you want to know about, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. Let's start with this is an easy one. How should advocates think about the difference between peer-reviewed research and gray literature for nonprofits? It seems like more and more organizations are producing their own literature. Is this stuff worse quality or better quality than peer reviewed? The same? How do we tell the difference?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that peer-reviewed research goes through a more rigorous review process than most studies produced by nonprofits do. But and I also don't think it's especially controversial to say that nonprofits have some kind of bias, right? There's a reason the nonprofit exists, a moral or ethical reason that I work at Faunalytics, that all of you are here today. In other words, we're going to be as a nonprofit sort of selecting studies that we think will ultimately be useful in our collective effort to reduce animal suffering, right? We're also going to be making recommendations that consider how our findings can be used by advocates to help animals. However, that doesn't in and of itself mean that the quality of the work is lower, and academic researchers have biases as well, right? Nonprofits just have clearer ones a lot of the time. And there's a lot of really high quality work coming out by nonprofits, but also all nonprofits aren't the same in their approach. So there's a huge spectrum in terms of the rigor, I guess, with which an organization approaches research and the research experience of the people working there. So just like in the academic world, it's helpful to know the reputation of certain journals because that can be a proxy for the quality of publications, right? So like Nature or The Lancet or something like that. It's also important to get a feel for the organization publishing research. And I think we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the principles for evaluating the trustworthiness of that research, transparency, accurate representation of what can be said based on methods, things like that. I guess I'll also say that I think that a lot of academic writing can be very dry and technical or jargony. And a lot of the time these articles they're being written for academics or for people who are deep in the research world. Quick plug for the Faunalytics Research Library, which tries to make some of those articles more digestible and I think does a pretty good job of it. But yeah, work done by nonprofits is often aimed less at other researchers and more at advocates or other sections of the public, which can include other researchers, but is generally written in a more accessible way. But it is worth saying that, because it doesn't often go through the peer review process, the literature produced by nonprofits isn't always held in the same regard by academics or policymakers or whoever. But again, there's a lot of really high quality work being done by nonprofits.
Yeah, and I can just quickly add, Carl actually wrote a really good blog on the ethics of peer reviewed in terms of a lot of these journals these days are run like a business. So you have to like pay a fee to get your research article through the peer reviewed process, which then gets published in their journal. And there are a lot of predatory journals out there that will basically guarantee that your article will get published within a few days, go through a sketchy peer review process, and then boom, your article is there. So I think that blog does a really good outline of kind of things to look out for in terms of like what makes a certain journal predatory or not. And yeah, I'll give a shout out to like a good ethical journal, which is the Fair Journal. I'm sure we can link it there. I know there are some people in the attendees who are academics and who basically they volunteer to like put this journal together. So, and it's for animal advocates because they also try to get at the issue of accessibility that Zach was talking about. Like they try to have like a lay summary for animal advocates while still having like scientific integrity.
Great. So, can you maybe walk us through a few red flags that might signal that a study is less reliable? It's, I guess, like there are these websites that will give you a list of like disreputable journals, and we've sometimes gotten questions about this about our research library, and our answer is usually like, well, we evaluate the methodology rather than specific journals because there can still be good literature published in bad places, and so. What are some red flags that might signal a study is less reliable?
Yeah, so I think the biggest red flag for me would be that a study doesn't follow open science principles. So basically, open science is where researchers will pre-register what they want to do with this study. So they'll basically say, I'm going to collect data this way. I'm going to sample these types of people, do this type of analysis. And that is a way to basically minimize bias during data collection. And minimize bias during the analysis. And it's also with the open science framework now more common for researchers to actually upload their data sets as well as the analysis that they did on the internet so that anyone can actually see what they did. So this helps create a sense of trust between the scientific community and the public. And like I said, it does reduce a lot of bias because it makes the researcher have to stick to the original plan. So they're not just making things up along the way when they're analyzing the data. Of course, there are situations where a researcher might deviate from what they said they were going to do in the original pre-registration, but that's usually always like explicitly stated in the article. Um, so yeah, it's usually quite easy to find if a study has been pre-registered. Like you go to the Open Science Framework website, or like within the actual original article, it'll say like it should link to the actual where their pre-registration is, where their data is uploaded. And I'll just mention like another big red flag, and then Zach can add on to it if they like, is industry funding. So in our movement, like we definitely sometimes do cite like animal agriculture studies, but it can be a huge red flag when that particular study is funded by Big Ag itself. And this becomes problematic because there has been actual research that has found that industry funded professors do shape public opinion and policy that benefits big ag industry, and this has been found for like the environmental sector. And I think we summarized that study that I'm referring to right now. The authors used a checklist to assess like industry bias. I definitely recommend looking at that checklist that they use if you're really interested about industry funding and how that can bias just bias the movement.
Yeah, Andrea covered a lot of the things that sort of come to mind for me, but I guess one thing that I'll add that has some overlap with the point about open science principles is just that kind of transparency across the board is very important. If you're looking at a study and it's not or a summary of a study somewhere and it's not clear, when the study was conducted, was it 10 years ago? Was it 20 years ago? Was it you should be able to know like the pretty much the exact dates, right? The months that it took place, who made up the sample, what methods the study used, how the data was analyzed. If any of that is missing, it's all kind of a sign that the authors could potentially be taking some liberties with the information that they're presenting. It's important to know the things like, was this conducted on 20 Psych 101 students, or was it a representative sample of an entire country's population or something like that?
Awesome. Thank you both. I feel like this brings to mind trying to think about how advocates can sort of navigate understanding different kinds of studies. Like, what is the difference between a survey versus an experiment versus an observational study? Are there times when you're using all three methods? Are they mutually exclusive? Uh, what are the common misunderstandings about methodology that advocates should be aware of?
Yeah, I can try to say just a few quick points, just in the interest of time. I think when people are saying how they would or will act, that's very different from actually measuring an action itself, right? So that those like how would you act or how will you act, those kinds of questions tend to come up in surveys, which are often kind of cheaper and easier to run, or take less sort of technical knowledge of analysis than maybe an experiment, right? And an experiment allows you to sort of isolate cause and effect. So rather than just talking about an association, you can sort of say the only thing different in these two scenarios was X. And so you can say that X is the cause of this difference, right? Um, and with a survey or observational data, I think this sort of phrase that comes up a lot is that correlation does not equal causation, right? You can say two things are associated, but that doesn't necessarily mean that X caused Y or that Y caused X. I recently saw a graph that was showing that there's a really strong correlation between the number of movies that Will Smith is in and electricity generation in Kosovo. And I feel like I haven't fact checked this, but I feel pretty confident that those two things aren't linked. So just because two things kind of like trend together doesn't mean that they are actually connected to one another in that strong of a way. So that's a reason to do an experiment, for example, over a survey. I do think you kind of have to learn to analyze experimental data, and that can be a little bit tougher. And people often sometimes think that an experiment, the word experiment makes it sound like it's like this novel or really difficult to sort of understand, complicated design, but it can really be as different as just like two groups being shown two different images and asking them what they think. Um, yeah.
Andrea?
Yeah, for the experiment, I love experiments. Would love to do some more at Faunalytics, and yeah, we actually might do some more next year. But I think the biggest limitation with running experiments, like yes, it's great at us understanding cause and effect because you can basically control so many things, but with that, like you do end up, at least the ones that I have experience doing, like in an artificial setting. So, for example, I looked at the impact of protests, for example, on people's animal product consumption. But to show people what a protest is, I can just create a protest in the real world and, then measure did they go vegan after? Like that just takes way too long. It's very complicated to do something like that. So we had to do it like artificially. And so what we did was like we showed people videos of like an actual protest. So that is the limitation, and that kind of takes away the real world context when you do it in an artificial setting, but it's still obviously like super useful to run.
Awesome. I love just how much we try and break down these concepts for a lot of animal advocates who don't have a research background, who don't understand like where to begin with this. Um, Thinking about different methodologies, can you maybe describe for the people here how different methodologies lead to different conclusions? Like what kind of conclusions do are commonly drawn from like a survey versus a an observational study?
Yeah, a survey can be really helpful at getting an idea of how people think about things when they are directly asked, right? It's sort of like a poll. Um, an experiment, a well-designed experiment, by contrast, sort of actually allows you to say, like we were saying, the sort of the cause and effect, right? Recognizing, like Andrew was saying, that the setting is at least a little artificial. They let you see how people would actually act, rather than how they say they would act, which is more like what a survey would do. Observational data, if it's not like in the form of a survey, is like sort of looking at how things are happening and just measuring them, right, without sort of interfering in any way. Um, and then there's also things like kind of like focus groups that I think can be helpful at coming up with different conclusions. They can provide a lot of really great information. You're typically working with kind of like a small group of people and asking them questions about something and then being able to sort of ask follow-up questions, dive deeper into things. But because they're sort of smaller groups, they're not necessarily representative of the broader population. But you can often use that information to inform other research methodologies, right? Maybe you figure out how to design your survey based on the feedback that you got from a focus group or something like that. So there's a time and a place for all of these different methods, and they can often be used sort of together. There can be an experimental component of a survey or something like that, or you can sort of do them one after the other and sort of build a body of research like that.
Yeah, and I'll just plug in for qualitative research, like yeah, you were talking about focus groups, but even like one-to-one interviews are super useful to gather rich data on like more sensitive topics or like neglected topics where you don't really understand the landscape. So for example, like I was really interested in understanding inclusion in, the farm animal advocacy movement. And I wasn't just going to run a survey that asked people like, have you experienced sexism, racism, transphobia, like yes, no, or even on the frequency. It's just like, I don't know, it's not really useful. So for sensitive topics like that, like I think it's a lot better to get the narrative from the individuals affected, to really understand that those types of issues. So yeah, shout out to qualitative research.
Shout out to qualitative research. I love it. Um, we have a few minutes left for the sort of prepared discussion that we had, and then I would really love to get to Q&A because that's where things can get even more interesting. So, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question because this is kind of what Faunalytics is all about, is how can advocates assess the applicability of research to their specific work or campaigns?
Yeah, so definitely review the methods first. Like you want to ask questions. You want to be like a journalist. You want to know who, what, when, where, and when. I'm not sure if I repeated a W there, but when you look at a study, so like who was included in that sample? Does it match your audience that your advocacy organization works for, that your campaign is trying to target? Second, was the study conducted in the same country that you are doing advocacy in? Is it similar culture? And did the study look at your outcomes that you're interested in? So if you're interested in things like individual diet change, you want to make sure that study actually looked at behavior and not just intention. So that's important. And then after reviewing the methods, you want to make sure with the results, not just focusing on the results of the single study, but seeing is this a pattern that I've seen like across studies? And I know that's time consuming, but you can always contact us with our office hours, or you can email us and we can actually help you. Carl's like our librarian as well. Like that's why we have our office hours, is like you're short on time. You want to know what the general landscape is for a specific topic in animal advocacy. We got you. So basically, yeah, just review the research context and make sure if those findings were replicable or not before you assess how applicable those findings are to your campaign.
And I don't really have too much to add to that, other than to sort of say there may be cases also where other organizations have tried to do something similar to what you're considering doing, and or have followed research that's already out there. So there may be sort of other real world examples that you can kind of learn from. Can be helpful to reach out to people who've actually conducted the research. Maybe they'll know if anybody else has tried to sort of apply those findings. A good reason for you to let researchers know if you have used their work. And yeah, I think coming to our office hours, like Megan just dropped in the chat there, is always a great way to sort of think through some of these studies a little bit more and figure out ways that it might apply to your particular situation.
Perfect timing. Great answers. Thank you both. Um, I'm going to start off with a question from Moro, and I really love this. I love the emphasis on open science principles, and yet still wonder just how much content from nonprofits is nowhere near that threshold. My question is, what role do you see for animal advocacy work that isn't A plus science, but still contributes to a larger knowledge base? I guess maybe I could rephrase this question like, is there a threshold where you think like good enough is good enough?
I can take a stab at this first, Andrea. I think any information, provided that it's not like very terribly done, right, is going to probably be better than no information at all. That said, all of the things we've sort of been talking about in terms of how to sort of like figure out if something is trustworthy or not is all still very important, right? So even if it's not A plus, you still want it to be above passing, right? Like, I don't think we want to think of it too binary, right? Not just like as a pass fail kind of thing. I do think that there is a certain threshold that we want to sort of um, stay at. But this is also one of my sort of like one of my kind of like pet causes, I guess, is that I think we should be doing more replication as a movement because I think we replication is a really important part of science, right? Just because one study once found something doesn't mean that that's going to hold in different conditions, even if that condition is just like a couple of years in the future, right? Um, so the more we replicate it, the more we're able to sort of trust a finding. So even if there are maybe questions or limitations of a study, as there are with all studies, right? We can't answer every question and control for everything in every study. The more we are able to sort of replicate a result and find it in different settings, the more we're able to trust that result.
Andrea, did you want to take that?
I mean, I can just the first thing that came to my mind when I read that question was like the data that I have been using that's compiled by advocates I found useful because it's observational data, like the data from chickenwatch.org, which tracks basically the commitments that corporations make in terms of going cage free. And I believe like what people do is like they actually upload a screenshot of the commitment, either the commitment that was said on social media post and like they have the date logged and everything, and boom, that becomes a data point. So this whole website really is, I don't know how many people are behind it or if it's just like advocates just going like I don't know the technicality behind it, but like that is a really big data set that has come together in thanks to so many advocates. And again, it's observational data, but I found it so useful. So I don't think that really answered the question, but I've just been using that data set a lot and I found it extremely helpful to answer questions when it comes to corporate commitments and their impact. So
Yeah,
stay
I think
tuned for the future publication on that.
yeah, and I think what you're getting at is that different that advocacy groups can still contribute to a
Mhm.
knowledge base
Yeah,
without conducting science, quote unquote.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this leads to another question in the Q&A box, which is how should we handle studies that contradict each other? What if one study finds an intervention does X and then we replicate that or try to replicate it and find that that's not true or not true in this other context or yeah. Easy.
That's a great question. So I love that because like being it goes back to being data driven as like your value as an animal advocate. So being data driven, like you have to be adaptable when new information comes in. So it's like I think it in those cases you just really have to. It's like trial and error. It really depends on so many factors of your specific advocacy that you're doing, like what the contradiction is. Like is the contradiction that the finding is different between two different demographics or is it bigger than that? So I don't know, I think it really is like a case by case basis, and I know that's a super generic answer, but um I was just I don't know, Zach
Yeah, I
have
know.
more to say.
I was having the sort of same thought, right? If a study is conducted in the US and finds one thing
Mhm.
and then in Canada and finds something else, but you're in the UK, it's hard to know which one to sort of go with, right? Which of these countries is sort of like a better match. And you can take a guess, you can conduct your own study, obviously easier said than done. But I think I think that's sort of the thing about good science, I guess, is that if there is no clear answer, unfortunately, sometimes that is the case, right? Because we don't want to just pick one thing and say, well, this one is sort of the better thing for me. Potentially, right? This is what I want to be true. Because that's the reason we're doing this research in the first place, right? Is because we want to know as best we can what the truth is. And if it's unclear, like sometimes that is the case, and we can do our best to sort of figure out which one, like I was saying, kind of like applies best to our particular scenario.
Hmm.
Um, but we can't always know the exact answer for everything, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I think that kind of leads into Jesse's question here, which says it can be difficult not to only select research that aligns with what we want a result to be. What tips do you have to avoid that? And I'm not sure exactly if they're asking just about sort of picking and choosing which studies we pay attention to, or if they're talking about actually formulating research questions that aren't going to lead us to a result that we just want. Um, and so maybe either of you could touch on either of those things. One, okay, Jesse says both apply. So, yeah, how do we make sure that we're not just listening to the study results that we want to hear, and how do we avoid asking the research questions that just lead us to the data we want to have?
I guess this is like confirmation bias in a way, whether you're the researcher or you're the advocate looking at information from the researcher angle, like you can definitely reduce that through open science framework and those principles, because those are meant to reduce like you as a researcher making stuff up along the way as you collect data. But from an advocate perspective, I'm not too sure how to like avoid that. I don't know if there's like keywords that you can play around with, or if there's different types of like, yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that one a little more from an advocate perspective.
Yeah, I think it can be tough, especially if you see results that do sort of contradict what your sort of like prior beliefs were, or what you just like hope was the case if you didn't have a prior belief. And some of that is just like trying to go into all of these topics kind of curious. And I feel like for me, being data driven is sort of about like making the best decisions that you can with the information that's available to you. Um, and it's an ongoing process, I guess, of taking in new information and figuring out how it relates to your current situation and assessing how to update your actions based on that. And I think sometimes we see a result that is unfortunate or not what we want, or doesn't align with something, and we can be bummed out by that, which is very, very legitimate. But I also think it doesn't mean that we have to sort of, and I'm not necessarily saying, Jesse, that this is what you're suggesting, but we can try to change those things, right? If we find that public opinion isn't on our side or something like that, rather than staying away from that kind of topic, I think we can try to shift that too. So um, that's a little different, I guess, from what you were asking, but as an attempt to put a positive spin on maybe not always finding results that are sort of perfectly aligned with what we would hope.
Yeah, well, I mean, to put this in historical perspective, I mean, Faunalytics is no stranger to putting out research results that people have not wanted to hear necessarily. And in some ways, that's one of the things that's actually brought us to having a better reputation in the movement. Sometimes the results that we get, as hard as they are to hear, are actually the ones that inform us most about strategy. I would add here too that, if you're only reading one or two studies on a topic, you're not doing enough research. I'm sorry to tell you, but you need to read more. You need to dive into these questions deeper than a Google search. I would heartily recommend searching Faunalytics library. We just published our 6,000th entry in the Faunalytics library just yesterday. So today is 6,001 and counting. And one of the nice things about our library is that every research summary in that library has a small paragraph in it that describes some takeaways for advocates. So I will be the first to say that do not just read one study in our library and say that that's your conclusion. But with 6,000 entries in there, you have a really good starting point on a lot of your research questions that you might have. If you have other research questions beyond that, then we have office hours. We have a research advice section that can help you to start to design your own research. And we're always here to help you do your best work possible. And with that, I'm going